So today we're going to be looking at the Elizabeth Loftus research on memory. And so let's take a look at the article first that I asked you to read. All right, so the quote there, the most horrifying idea is that what we believe with all of our hearts is not necessarily the truth. So Elizabeth Loftus, one of my favorite psychological researchers, started out, it says she wanted to teach mathematics, but then got into psychology. And she wrote this book on memory, looking at leading questions. So if you have your notes out, we left off the other day looking at the mutability of memory. This is what are leading questions. So hopefully you could answer that from this article. A leading question is a question where you're kind of planting how you want the question to be answered into that their mind, right? So we're, in this case, she did this experiment, which she mentions in the TED Talk that you watched yesterday, how just changing the verb, hit or smash or collided or bumped, etc., changed how people answered the question about how fast the cars were going. But then these other leading questions, instead of saying, was there broken glass, they said, remembering the broken glass. And then, did you see the broken headlight? Far more responded yes than if they were asked, did you see a broken headlight? See, there's the leading question. Did you see the broken headlight? So you can create blips in people's memory. You can plant false memories by leading questions. So this kind of ties into the next question in the notes. How are false memories created? Well, oftentimes it's by leading questions, or it's by other people interfering with your memory by saying how they remember things to go. So like you see here at the beginning in the introduction, when she was 14, her uncle said that she had found her mother who had drowned in the swimming pool. So she created, because of her uncle's interference, she created false memories where she vividly remembered her mom drowning, finding her mom who had drowned in the swimming pool tragically. And then she learned later, no, it was actually her aunt that found her mother, not her. And so now she had these false memories, which is part of what piqued her interest into this study. So then we look at this epidemic of therapy. So this is psychoanalytical therapy based on the work of Freud, where these therapists would work hard at recovering memories of sexual abuse. And there are all kinds of crazy stories. I'm sure you were shocked by some of what you read. It says the theory underlying the practice of recovering memories in therapy was that such horrendous events had occurred but had been pushed out of memory, repressed, as a way of escaping the pain of the memories, and that such repressed memories, denied expression were toxic and produced symptoms until they were brought into the light of consciousness. So this is big into Freud's work, right? You, as a defense mechanism, your mind buries tragic events, so you never deal with them. But yet because you have this toxic event in your mind, it poisons your life, and so you're depressed or you have anxiety, and so you go to a therapist, and instead of addressing your depression and anxiety, they say this, there must have been sexual abuse from your family when you were a kid, and that's the start. And most of these people, because they're suffering from depression or anxiety or other issues, that's why they're seen as a psychiatrist or a psychologist. They obviously trust the therapist and they go down this rabbit hole. And next thing you know, they're accusing their parents of all kinds of things. And this is through leading questions and implanting false memories. And it says here that research doesn't support repressed memory. What research supports is that if you had something traumatic happen to you, it's more the form of PTSD. So I wrote that in the margin here. Post-traumatic stress disorder, where you are haunted by the trauma, not that you've repressed the trauma. So we'll come back to that idea. So here's just an example. Just a couple other things I put here. So Loftus was called to the courtroom to testify in over 200 trials as an expert witness on the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. And so they just show how in this next section how you can implant false memories. And so I highlighted this conclusion aspect. It says some people would say, why would children lie about such things? Or why would eyewitness testimony, why would that be a lie? Well, we're not accusing the children of lying. False memories do not come with labels. They might be quite indistinguishable from real ones and reported sincerely. Most likely, if you talk to Elizabeth Loftus after she had that conversation with her uncle about finding her mom, she would have said, yeah, I found my mom. She would have been convinced of it. However, that was not reality. So obviously Loftus's goal is not to protect child abuse, far from it, but at the same time, it's to protect people who could have their lives destroyed by this implanting of false memories. So in 1992, they formed the False Memory Foundation. In the first year, over 3,700 people came forward to share their stories. And I recently looked at the False Memory Foundation. It just dissolved, actually, December 31, 2019, so last December, after being in place for about 27 years. And the reason they cited for dissolving was just that because of the research of Elizabeth Loftus and others, the tide has turned against this type of therapy. And they have all kinds of stories on that website. One of the ones I was reading was about a woman who was in her mid-30s and she was depressed and she went to a therapist, and the therapist said there must be sexual abuse from when you were a kid from your parents. And so she created this narrative and on the encouragement of her therapist, and she came back to her next therapy session. She said, I think it might have happened, and here's some details I kind of think I remember. And the therapist said, send these to your mom. She needs to know what she did to you. She sent them to the mom. The mom denied it, of course. The therapist said, oh, your mom's denying it. That's just further proof that it really happened. And it just plunged this family into craziness. Well, years later, more than 5 years later, because this woman broke off contact with her parents, her therapist said her parents are toxic to her, and that's why she was having problems. Well, eventually, she came out of this terrible circumstance created by her therapist, and her, obviously, she made the choices to accuse her parents. And it turns out that, yeah, she did have unresolved things with her parents that she needed to work on. One of them was that she had this traumatic abortion as a teenager, and she never told her parents, and this was something that weighed on her because it was a horrible experience that affected her deeply, but then she couldn't talk to her parents about it because she was ashamed because she had gotten pregnant by her boyfriend, and her parents were very kind of authoritarian, and she just struggled with that, and that's what led to some depression and anxiety. And her parents had lost a child. Her mom had had a baby stillborn, and her mom had a lot of difficulties processing through that. So they both had these issues they brought to the table, but it wasn't repressed sexual abuse. It was events, traumatic events that happened in life that were not talked through or gone through in a loving, supporting way. Also, then you saw in the TED Talk yesterday, looking at uh, the case of this man who was falsely accused of rape and how that destroyed his life, because even after he was released, when the real rapist was found, he couldn't let it go, and he got stressed and eventually died of that heart attack traumatically. So you see the power of false memory. Now, perhaps this reminds you, like it reminds me, of the Judge Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. So Judge Kavanaugh, of course, is on the Supreme Court now, but when the Senate was going through their confirmation hearings, a story came out that this woman, Dr. Ford, accused him of sexual abuse when he was in high school, way back in the early 1980s, so almost 40 years ago. And and then there were other women who came out and accused Judge Kavanaugh as well. And if you look back at the stories, you see that I'm not saying, like Dr. Ford, for example, went through a polygraph test to see if she was lying, and she passed the polygraph test. And some people were pointing to that and saying this is proof that what she says is true. And we don't know with 100% certainty. All I'm saying is that from my perspective, this Loftus's research does factor into how I interpret the situation, because it happened such a long time ago. She never came forward in that 40-year period with Judge Kavanaugh's name as a person that abused her. In 2012, she had mentioned people from a elitist school that have high-ranking jobs now, but she didn't bring out his name until shortly before the confirmation hearing. So all of a sudden, 40 years later, she knows it's this guy, whereas in all the years previous, she never mentioned it was Kavanaugh himself. So it's those kind of factors that say this could be the false memory phenomenon. And I'm not saying that Dr. Ford didn't go through some trauma. She most likely did. I'm just not convinced that it was Judge Kavanaugh who was part of that. And that's the difficulty. So it's a hard thing. False memory is a ridiculously hard thing, because the memories are there. They believe them with certainty that they're true, but as Loftus's research shows, does not guarantee that they're actually the truth. Going along with that, if you read, I put up 2 readings for today. The one is from the textbook, page 165. Again, going off of Loftus's research on eyewitness testimony. That will be helpful. And then the article from the New York Times about an attack and how people explained what they saw versus what really happened. So make sure you read those in conjunction with this video on false memory.